And we're live once again with another episode session of NX Office Hours. We pushed it back a day to Tuesday instead of Monday. I know everybody's probably watching the Apple event yesterday, so we didn't want to try to compete for eyeballs with with the Apple event, so we pushed it back to today. But NX Office Hours, where we talk about all things NX, we answer questions and try to answer questions from the chat room or things that have come up on Twitter. If you have questions, feel free to ask them in the chat, and we'll try to answer them here. If we can't answer them here, we'll get answers for you and get back in touch with you. I'm Brandon Roberts, Brandon T. Roberts on Twitter. And Jack, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, yeah. So I'm another contributor on NX, and I'm responsible for most of the React stuff if anyone's using it. So you can either be really happy or you might hate what I'm doing. I'm not sure. Hopefully it's a former. So as a developer, I've been doing web dev for quite a while. So I've been using React for a number of years, Angular for a number of years. Even before that, and people remember like Backbone and all those good old days of MVC frameworks. Anyway, so I'm actually really excited about the React adoption for NX. I think it's a really good tool for, in my opinion, any team that uses React should be using NX. But hopefully,
we went through this last time. Me and Philip. It was like, if you're using building Angular apps, you should probably be using NX. So we got you saying the same thing on the React side, and we didn't hear this like just from us. We've heard it from people in the community also. But yeah, you say if you're using React, you should be using NX to build apps with, right?
Basically, and I think that the case is actually stronger for React than Angular, believe it or not, because like if you use Angular, you already have the Angular CLI, and we're maybe a little bit biased, but we think the NX CLI is really awesome. Especially with some of the latest features like caching, distributed caching. But for React developers, it's actually even more compelling because you're basically able to use tools that you don't have otherwise in the ecosystem, right? So stuff like code generation with schematics, a lot of the tooling that I guess Angular developers kind of take for granted. React developers don't have them. So I think by using NX, it's actually a lot of things that you just get for free, even without all the really cool advanced features that NX gives you.
So yeah, full disclosure, I don't have much React experience at all. Like if somebody told me to build a React app, I would reach for a create React app if I didn't know about NX. So what's a normal like stack for React, like a React project? Like,
yeah, that's a really good question. I think it really varies, but nowadays, I think it's pretty safe to say the most common is probably Create React App, which is CRA for short. They improved it quite a bit in the last few years. So I think before it was more treated as you use it to scaffold your app, and then you eject, meaning like you basically eject right away, so you get exposure to all the webpack configuration and everything. Because like any real React workspace, I think, will eventually customize their Babel stuff in their Webpack config. But I think the CRI has gotten to a point where people don't need to eject anymore. So I would feel safe to say that's probably the most common setup. But I think in the wild, there's just so many different ways you can do React app. And I think that's a struggle for NX a little bit, just because we have to support many different workspace configurations. So people looking for how to customize Babel. And I think in the last year, we've improved that quite a bit, especially with 9.4, where we did a big refactor to how Babel is set up. So before, when you want to customize Babel, there's a roundabout way where you can do it. You basically have to modify the webpack config. Now that whole story is a lot cleaner. So you just have like a Babel RC file that we generate for you, and you can extend it if you want to. So I think like if you haven't used NX before and you are using React, now's the best time to jump in and check it out.
Okay, so that brings us to like a good question that we get or that we're getting more and more these days is like, how do you migrate existing React workspaces to NX? Because you talked about create React app, but that's like a separate thing with Webpack and something that most people eject out of. So is that process difficult? I mean, I think you've done this. You've done this a few times, but at this point, right? So talk about what the process is like, at least.
Yeah, I think there's different ways you can tackle it. And actually, I'm working with Isaac, who's also on the NX team, and we're gonna have some migration documentation soon, maybe in the next few weeks, so people can take a look at that. But the general idea is, because React workspaces can be very custom, we're going to focus on a few cases to begin with. So CRA, the thinking is that you can actually migrate by copying pasting your existing application to like a new NX workspace. So you can do like create NX workspace and choose the empty preset, which is what we recommend if you want more power. Because if you choose the React preset, we're going to just make some assumptions on how you want to generate your workspace. And that's not true for create React app. So you want to choose the empty preset. And then after that, we actually have a nifty builder called run commands. You can use it to pretty much wrap any script. So it just so happens the create React app has this basically like a package called React scripts. And that's what's going to give you the start, the build, and the test command. So you just want to wrap that with run commands, and we'll have documentation for that soon. But if you want, that's probably the easiest way to create a workspace from convert it from create React app. If you have a very basic application, I would say you can just create a React workspace and choose a React preset, and then try to copy over your source and see if that works. If it doesn't work, you can try the run commands as well, because basically there's no real reason you cannot use run commands for everything. The one thing that you want to watch out for is because the way that NX works, you have to make sure you have a tsconfig file for your app so we can pick up all the workspace libraries properly, because we rely on that being there.
Yeah. So I don't know what I guess the skew is one way or the other, but I know that like a lot of React projects still haven't like moved over to using TypeScript yet, and they still use regular, or I call it vanilla JavaScript to write apps. But I guess we support both of those use cases, right? Whether you want to go full TypeScript, or we recommend you use TypeScript, but if you want to just do vanilla JS, that option is there.
Yeah. So all of our schematics when it comes to React has --JS option, which means instead of generating TypeScript, it's going to be all JavaScript. Like we still recommend use TypeScript just because I think it makes a lot more sense. But I understand from especially like existing workspace, you may not want to convert everything over, right? It's going to take time. The only requirement though is you still have to run through TypeScript. So we use the Babel preset for that. And the reason, like I said, is if you don't use TypeScript, we wouldn't be able to map all the workspace projects together, because we use the compiler options in there, the paths option, to basically map everything together. So that's the only thing. You can basically just add the tsconfig, just ignore it, and just edit your code as if you're not using TypeScript, and everything just works, right?
Okay.
So just like don't look at
the file. You put the tsconfig for the path, and then you just like shove it away in the corner, and you just don't look at it anymore.
Exactly, and we actually did a few conversions like this because I think it's still very, I don't know. Some people still don't really like TypeScript, even though we recommend it all the time. So instead of fighting that, we're just saying you can still use JavaScript. Just make sure you have this one file, and that's it.
I feel like we're just like easing the transition onto them. Like, okay, oh, you don't want to use TypeScript? Okay, cool. Well, how about the tsconfig file? Maybe you start with that. And then you kind of bait them in with the tsconfig, and then they slowly over time may try to start using it more.
Exactly. And if you generate a workspace, like you'll notice for Angular projects, basically only TS files are included in the tsconfig. For React projects, we set allow JS to true by default, and we also include JS and JSX files. So yeah, like you said, it's just we put it in there. If you want to do it, try it. If you don't want to do it, just ignore it. But maybe someone on the team will actually create a TS file, and then they'll feel like, oh, this is this is why we want to use TypeScript and no convert.
Hmm.
Maybe.
Yeah, I see. So that at least didn't seem like you have to do too much to get a relatively small React project into an NX workspace. Um, yeah, and we'll see about, like I say, we'll see about the docs for that coming up soon about that. And I know we use, like, there's like the React application side of it. Um, what I guess we, let's see, we have React, and then we have other integrations that are like for Next, things that are built on top of React, I should say.
Yeah. So I guess they're called like meta frameworks. That's what people call them. They're not
Hmm.
like true frameworks because they use React. And actually, for migration on those kind of meta framework apps, it's much easier. It should be just create a React workspace, choose either Next.js, or we just announced the Gatsby support as well last week
Hmm.
with 9.4. It's still it's stable more or less, but we still call it experimental just in case like there's anything we need to fix up. But with internal testing, it seems pretty good.
Hmm.
So you can create a Next.js and a Gatsby workspace and just copy and paste your source over, and it should work because our structure doesn't differ from like the actual normal Next or
Okay.
Gatsby
Okay.
setup. So that migration path is actually much simpler than like, because like I said, React application or React workspace can have any kind of setup.
Hmm.
Um,
You mean
at
like the
least
one where you said that they do create React app and like immediately eject, or the just in general for NX workspaces?
just in general, because there's also a lot of like boilerplate
Hmm.
projects on GitHub that
Why
people.
is it everybody on who comes on the channel says something about boilerplate?
Well, for React app for a long
Yeah.
time, right? Before Create React app was a thing, people relied on boilerplate because like,
Hmm.
how do you start a React app? You can't unless you know what you're doing. So you basically you have to do like npm init or yarn init, and then just start typing everything by yourself, or you start copying pasting from Stack Overflow. Like it's just insane. So people started creating or curating these boilerplates, and I think the most popular one might still be active. It's called I think it's just called like React boilerplate or something. And it started
Okay.
by the same guy that made style components and
Hmm.
a bunch of other open source projects. And it's basically React and Redux and everything together. Um, so people just start with that boilerplate. But as they're developing the app, there's no more scaffolding support, right? There's no more
Yeah.
code generation. So then they're basically just copying pasting components, copying pasting.
Oh yeah. There's nothing that can go wrong with copy and pasting components, right?
Yeah, I mean, it works, but I
Yeah.
think that the worst part about copying pasting is like you don't know what you're copying exactly. So you
Hmm.
don't know if like this is in that component because it's needed for every component, or it's like incidental complexity. Like it's
Hmm.
in there because there's a specific reason for that component to have this, right? I think you can even see that with testing. Like tests shouldn't be too complicated for the most part, but you have no idea why certain things are set up that way, so you just copy everything just in case, and then
Hmm.
your code quality really goes down right after that. So I think with code generation, you can either trust us and just use ours. If you don't like ours for whatever reason, like I am not going to be offended, right? Like if you don't like the stuff I wrote.
No, I'm gonna say you have to use everything that we generate just the way it is.
I think like it's a really good starting point, especially for educational purposes too. Like we use
Hmm.
some of the latest frameworks and tools. Like we use testing library, we use Redux toolkit, which I think everyone should be using. So you should at least check our schematics. If you don't
Hmm.
like it, you can always write your own. We have workspace schematics. So if you, for some reason, don't like ours, you can just write your own, and that's fine
Yeah.
too.
Yeah, that is a good thing that at least we provide the tooling around creating your own schematics, or even like extending the stuff that we generate for you. And if you know how to, the APIs around schematics about how moving files around, things like that. So,
Right.
but you did mention something interesting about, you said that well, I don't want to put words in my mouth, but you said every project should be using Redux toolkit. You mean just in general, or if you're
Yeah.
using Redux, or just in general?
If you're using Redux, for sure. And I mean, you know this because you talk to Eric as well. But there's some
Hmm.
collaboration between NGRX and Redux Toolkit. So I
Hmm.
think there's a lot of really cool cross-pollination, so stuff like entities.
Mhm.
If you're a Redux user, you don't know what entities are, like you're doing it wrong. Like you should actually go to Redux Toolkit docs, read up what it is. If you're working with any kind of list state, so I have a list of users, list of to-dos, whatever, like you should be using entity. So I think like if you generate your workspace with our schematics, at least you get exposure to what's the latest and greatest.
Mhm.
And in terms of like React projects in general, I don't think they have to use Redux. Uh, there's a lot of other ways to do it. But I think if you're not sure, Redux is not a bad tool to reach for, especially with the toolkit being out. There's a lot less boilerplatey. There's a lot
Yeah.
more. I guess the API is a little bit nicer than just plain Redux.
Yeah, I definitely like the changes that Redux Toolkit made as far as making it easier to register state, and definitely of course I would be biased as far as the entity part, but because we kind of share that back upstream, I guess if you want to call it. But yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, and one thing that people don't really realize is, sure, you can just write your own API with React context and ignore Redux altogether, right?
Mhm.
But so when Redux refactored to use the new hooks and context API, they had to refactor back because the way that context works is actually not optimal for state updates for re-rendering. So there's a new project from Facebook called Recoil, which I am not actually super familiar with. I've only read some tutorials, play around, but that kind of tries to solve the problem differently. But Redux has its own optimization, so uh, there's no there's no real good reason not to use it. I think if you want to use it, it's completely fine.
Yeah. Okay. So React projects, I know like I said, we're advocating for using it for React projects and kind of building in that support there. Uh, you said there's like the application side of it, and then there's like the library side of it. So what do
Yeah.
most people on like in the React ecosystem use for managing like a set of libraries, or maybe even just one library? Well, I don't guess
Yeah.
you maybe for one, but how do you like scale up if you got like a suite of libraries that
Yeah.
you're
Right.
publishing?
So I guess like I can only speak to what I've seen in the wild. So different companies I've been to, you can either go the monorepo route or the multi-repo route. So multi-repo route, let's just agree it kind of sucks. If you don't agree with me, just ping me on Twitter and you can shout at me. But
Okay, yeah, he said that folks, he's got his Twitter handle right there. If you don't like mono repos and you like multi repos, just add
yeah,
him on Twitter and there you go.
yeah. So let's ignore the multi-repo way of doing it. But the monorepo way, I think the de facto is to use Lerna. And Lerna's a fine tool. It's fine. It's been around for years. It's very stable. It's mature. What it gives you, especially if you use it in combination with your workspaces, is that you can just have one workspace, like a one monorepo. You have all your libraries and packages folder, and it's fairly configurable. And it gives you some stuff like I can now publish, I can sync up versions, I can run many tests together. So instead of having to test each package separately, I can just say like I want to run tests for everything. So that's all fine. That's probably the most popular way to do it in React. Um, and I would say, and we do have a blog post on this too, but I would say like if you use Lerna, you should really check out NX, which basically does almost everything that Lerna does, but a lot better, and also provides more toolings like code generation and a bunch of community plugins that we're starting to get as well. The only thing that we don't do out of the box that Lerna does is we don't help you with versioning too much. Like,
Oh, right. So if you're publishing like a set of packages, we don't have a built-in way to use semantic versioning to bump the versions.
exactly.
Yeah.
And I know Lerna Workspace is like probably the most sane way I've done it before is you can say I want to sync up the version for all packages. So even if your package didn't change, when you publish, you still have to publish. You have to bump up the version for every single package in the workspace, and that's kind of close to what we recommend with NX anyway. So if you already do that and you don't have to manage different versions and stuff, I would say your transition to NX should be trivial. If you have to manage different versions of different packages, then that might be a little bit sticky when you use NX. So that's the only thing I think that someone may miss from Lerna, but that's it.
Okay, so I'm gonna bring up. We had talked, like I said, we had gotten this question before. I'm bring up the article that was there why you should switch from Lerna to NX, and like I said, the biggest thing here is applications versus open source projects, and there, like you talked about one. I guess one part of it of NX and Lerna kind of do some of the same things. Like you can build all your packages together, or build, test, and run certain commands against every library in your repo, right?
Yep.
But I think is that where the similarities end? Because of course we know like NX does more things than that. So
yeah, I think the task runner part of Lerna is not as smart as NX, and I mean I can say that because I know both fairly well. So with Lerna, especially when you're doing a monorepo, which I mean, if you're not using monorepo, why are you using Lerna? When it comes to CI, you have two choices, right? You can either say I only run tests for the packages I've changed. So if I have a bunch of packages in my monorepo and they depend on each other, I can say whatever's changed, I'll run the test for those. But the problem with that is like if I change a package that affected other packages, so you have dependencies between them, right, in the workspace, I have no idea if my changes actually broke something else because I'm not running that in my CI. So the only safe way to do it with Lerna is you have to say run everything all the time, which, as we know, like it's not scalable as your workspace is growing. So NX out of the box, you can say run affected, and it'll only run whatever's affected. And because we know the project graph, we know exactly what depends on each other, and we'll rerun everything that's basically in the affected path in the graph. So I think that's a. I mean, we kind of take that for granted now with NX, but if you're switching from Lerna, it's really powerful.
Yeah, I know that at least for running like the NX, building the NX packages, like if we had to do that every time, well, we at least we had to do it every time, up until recently. But just the time savings you get from only running the tests or building the packages for only the thing that changed is definitely a save. At least save me some time already. And I know that people, if like I said, if you're working within a large monorepo, then those things progressively get worse, right? As you increase the number of libraries or packages that you have within there.
Yeah, and even if your workspace is not huge, so recently we converted the NX repo itself to use NX, so we're able to benefit from all the same things that we keep preaching about, like caching and everything. And the cool thing is, like recently, like this week, I had a PR, and usually it'll take like 30 minutes, whatever, to run. I've made a typo in the doc in my PR, so I just had to fix it. But because I didn't actually touch any actual like source code, when I push it, the CI only took a minute to run instead of like half an hour because like all the computation for all the tests and everything is already cached. I didn't touch the source code. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, I think we have another article about NX caching somewhere, or we have so highly recommend checking that out as well.
Yeah, I'll see if I can bring it up here while we're looking through that. But you've done a lot, like as far as on the project graph itself. So how do the project graph it's just we scan through your files, or how do you build a project graph that we use for NX?
Yeah, so because we're focused mostly for now on TypeScript and JS projects, we use a TypeScript we use TypeScript to compile the AST, and we can inspect your imports and stuff, and then we ask TypeScript like, is this the workspace project? So we can start building out that graph with all the nodes and all the dependency edges. So based on that, we can do additional computation on it. And we did a refactor last year on how it's computed. So now it's a little bit more pluggable. So spoiler alert, intending to make it extendable. It's not extendable yet.
I should have said no spoilers. I should have said no spoilers. We gotta save something for the we gotta save something for the blog post.
And oops. No timeline yet, but we're trying to get something in there. So basically, once you build a project graph, we also have additional computation on top to say, like, given a set of file changes, can you start marking like what's the affected graph? Oh, sorry, what's the affected path on the graph? So all that, picking up the nodes, picking up the dependencies, and how affected is calculated will eventually be extendable. For now, it's not. But yeah, at some point it will be.
Okay, so this question from the YouTube channel, I think, kind of plays in well there. NX10 is have smarter affected. What changes can we expect to perform ourselves to utilize that new feature? Like, do the developers have to do anything to do that, or is that, I guess, does that lead into what you were just talking about, like the smarter affected or being pluggable in that way?
Yeah, it's really related. So before we hard code all the logic of how affected is how the behaviors, it's all hard coded inside like a function or like a class. And now that it's extendable, smarter means that, like, before we wouldn't understand your package JSON. So if you bumped up, say, your Angular core or your React package to a new version, we actually wouldn't know that actually affected your project, right? Because even though you import React, we couldn't detect that change because it's not a workspace project. So one of the things that we did initially is we parsed your package JSON, so we know, like, these npm packages are being used. So if their version ever changes, we also need to mark those projects as affected. So I think Jason and maybe a few other devs have been extending that a bit. So we can even be smarter about how we handle NX.json changes, tsconfig changes. So instead of saying, like, anytime tsconfig is touched, we just mark everything as affected, which is safe, but it's not the most optimum way to do it. We can be a little bit smarter about, okay, just because you touch a tsconfig file doesn't mean you have to retest every project. You probably just maybe change an entry here and there. Maybe you added a new project in the workspace, so nothing is affected really except for this new project and whatever is using it. So that's what being smarter is. And at some point that should be extendable. Again, no time frame for when that's going to be extendable, but it's something we keep thinking about because you can even extend it to other languages, right? Like if you want Python project in there, maybe like a Java project in C#. That should be fine.
I've seen that, at least in the NX community Slack. I've seen that a few times of people wanting to build with .NET or still be able to use like an NX workspace with .NET projects and still get all the affected features in that. So
yeah,
cool. So be looking out for that next week. No, I'm just kidding. At some point, at some point in the future, the smarter affected and pluggable will be there.
Yeah, so I guess just to make sure this question is answered for sure, when we say smarter effective for NX10, you don't have to do anything. Whatever improvements we made to NX itself, you should just get if you upgrade. The extendable part is separate, and I don't know any time frame for that, like I said, so just watch out for that. Brendan will blog about it when it comes out.
There you go. Blog post coming soon. It'll be in the release post, or if we have like a separate, we'll probably, if it's maybe we'll end up doing a separate post on that also, because I think it's pretty interesting how we were, at least how we're making it smarter and being able to use it across different platforms and not just TypeScript and JavaScript projects. Cool. So let's go through. I don't know if we had any other React specific questions here. Let me check the chat here. I don't see, or I'm checking Twitter first, and then I'll check the chat room because I know we got some questions there.
I'm gonna scan the chat room quickly.
Yeah. Let's see. We had, here's a plugin question. Well, we had one more that I guess we can talk about. And this one's about sharing things between apps. I know he had worked on like sharing assets between React apps, but this one is will produce another. Is there a solution in NX to share
Yeah.
compiled vendor bundles between apps?
Yeah. So quick answer is no. It's
Mm-hmm.
not something we support. Like the use case is not something we support right now, and I don't know if we ever will. The long answer is because we do expose the Webpack config. So if
Mm-hmm.
you generate an app, you'll see like in your workspace or Angular JSON, there's a Webpack config entry for your app, which basically takes in a Webpack config, and you can return a new Webpack config with. You can mutate anything. You can like
Mm-hmm.
add a loader, change the loader settings. So the long answer is you can mutate that somehow to get it to work. But out of the box, we don't do it. And I think the reason why people want to do it in the first place is because the compilation between changes, like if you are starting a dev server and you change something, you don't want to necessarily process everything again. And I think the way that I've seen a real app in NX, it may not be as slow as people think, even without the vendor bundle. But if you have speed issues, definitely like maybe open the issue or can feel free to ping me and maybe we can walk through it.
Mm-hmm.
And Webpack in the last version and even Webpack 5, I think, has been improved quite a bit, like from Webpack 2 and 3. So I don't know if the speed is still the main issue. If you're doing the separate vendor bundle that for other reasons, not speed, then maybe you can open the issue and we can take a look, because I don't know of any use case other than the speed.
Yeah, so basically you have to hack the Webpack config together. It's not it's something that it's not I guess it's not a common use case. So it'd be something that but you could extend easily though to do it.
Yeah, if you know what you're doing, you can easily extend it easily.
Yeah.
I mean, like I would just log out the Webpack config to see what's in there and then modify the
Yeah,
parts I need to.
there you go. Console log is your friend.
Exactly.
Um,
I actually see one interesting question
okay.
on this. So this one's from Justin asking, when building a plugin, what is the best way for the plugin to get a list of dependency of an app? So I'm not too sure what the context of this is for the plugin.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah, because I know we at least for our buildable, publishable libraries, like we have a way to grab those dependencies when you go to when you go to build one of those libraries. We grab you could have the option to grab the dependencies and have your
yeah. So
not updated for you.
yeah. So I'm just gonna make some assumptions on this. So we have another thing, because plugin is a very vague term, but we do have like NX plugins,
Yeah.
which I think maybe the context for this question.
Yeah,
But
I'm gonna go with they're talking about NX plugins.
yeah, but I think I can actually answer this generically. So the best way to figure out dependencies is we have this function called create project graph. I think we expose it from Narrow Workspace.
Mm-hmm.
I have to double check on that. But if you can somehow get that function out, you just call it. It has no arguments. If you call it, you get a project graph. And then from the project graph, you can see all the nodes, right? So you
Mm-hmm.
should be able to manually go through and figure out what the dependencies are between different apps and libraries. And all you have to do is implement some kind of like tree walking function, and you're good to go. So hopefully that helps people who are writing plugins. I don't know exactly what Justin wants to do with that knowledge, but the best way is to get the actual project graph and walk through all the edges.
Okay. So you talked about, I guess we talked about, like I said, this is the React edition, and you mentioned these, but we'll go ahead and put the question up here. Is there support for Gatsby and React Native? And
Yeah.
well, you talked about this just recently, or talked about this earlier about Gatsby, but can you talk about like what the process was of, because in most, I guess in most other ecosystems, we just kind of drop in. We use more of their tools to build their particular projects, but I think Gatsby was a little different in how we got that together,
Yeah.
right?
So Gatsby is super great because it's literally like zero configuration.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they have plugins and stuff, which is technically configuration. So I think they're cheating a bit when they say zero configuration. But because there's so zero configuration, we couldn't customize it at all. Right? They have this black box, and you can't go in and tweak stuff. So the way that we went about it is we just treated their CLI as the public API, which it is, and then we just wrap around it. So we literally just like fork a process that calls Gatsby and says like I want to do develop or build or start, and we do a little bit more on top of what Gatsby gets you. So for example, Max, who also helped quite a bit with the Gatsby plugin, he added an entry in there. So by default, if you use NX, your Gatsby app supports all the projects from your monorepo. So I think Gatsby support when it comes to monorepos it's not quite clear. So if you do use Gatsby and you want to use a monorepo, definitely try the NX one. We just like try to do everything for you out of the box, so you don't have to worry about it.
Yeah. So if I understand you correctly, like if you're most of the times when you're using a Gatsby project, it's just within like a single, we'll take the multi-repo. It's just going to be a single standalone project as opposed to being a project amongst other projects to where Gatsby could be your blog or your whatever. And then your other applications are just regular React projects.
Yeah, I guess the most compelling reason you might want to use Gatsby and NX is, like you said, like if you have a public website for marketing, whatever, you may still have a style guide or some kind of design system that your company uses. Like, how are you going to consume shared components, right? You either have to go to a multi-repo support, or sorry, approach, or if you want to use a mono-repo approach, then you have to figure out how to consume those packages, right? Because by default, Gatsby is not going to help you. You have to figure out like maybe which plugins to use and how to configure them. If you use NX, you just get it and you don't have to do anything. And Gatsby also
share some of those, like I said, generate those libraries for that you could normally use within just regular React projects and extend those to just use them in Gatsby without any additional setup.
Exactly. And there's also a way that Gatsby recommends you create components. There's like a components folder. You just dump everything in there. But if you want to share it with some other project, even if it's another Gatsby project, then you have to go through the process of extracting it, create another repo, setting up CI. If you use NX and you're already in a monorepo, then like first of all, you probably wouldn't put the components in your app. You probably create a library to host it. But even if you did,
I keep hearing you say people are doing things wrong. You say don't put all your components in a single folder.
Yeah, I mean it's not wrong because that's the way that it's set up to handle it. But even if you did that, and at some point you're like, you know what, I really need to share this component. If you're in a monorepo, you just literally click on the component, you just drag it to a library folder, and you're done. I mean, you have to like update your imports, but for the most part, it's pretty much like a drag and drop, which I think is really fantastic.
Yeah, definitely. And the React Native, so we don't support that directly, but and I do know that we have a plugin that has some integration with React Native. But I guess it's not. I guess the plugin shows that we can NX can easily be extended to support things like React Native or even ecosystems that we don't currently officially support, right?
Yeah, it's a really good point. Like if anyone out there are using frameworks and meta frameworks that we don't support, you don't have to wait for us anymore. You can just try creating your own plugin. You don't have to publish to the NPM, but if you want to share it because it's useful, but
you don't have to, but you probably should now.
Yeah, I mean, like some people are kind of scared to share something when it's early stage. I say like if you share it, at least you get some feedback, and for the most part, I think people are pretty positive to give like constructive feedback and stuff. So definitely do that. For React Native though, specifically, I think there's some challenges there. We have tried integration with React Native before. There's just a few things to work through, and unfortunately, we kind of shifted focus to some other things that we felt was more important for the time being, stuff like Next.js, Gatsby, and a few other things. So we are going to take a look at React Native again sometime this summer, I think. and hopefully we can get that in before the fall, or maybe sometime in the early fall.
Yeah, I know that we've taken like a specific focus on trying to make the React story a lot better than what it was initially, and trying, like I said, iron out a bunch of those common use cases that people have, whether they were just using Create React App or their own Webpack config before, where they could just easily like transition over to using the
Yeah.
NX.
And the React Native support would actually benefit greatly from extending the project graph and affected logic, because your workspace is basically going to contain both TS stuff and Java for Android, and also Objective-C for iOS. So we do handle those projects sort of, but we don't understand your imports. So I think we can actually make the story a lot nicer for React Native devs. Even if you're only maintaining one app, I think we can somehow link everything together in a nicer way than normally. At least that's the goal. That's what I was looking at before.
That's what we're aiming for, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is another question from Nicholas Cunningham. If I don't opt into using NX Cloud, I can still benefit from caching. It just won't be distributed. And
yeah, do you want to take this one, or I can?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, NX Cloud. Yeah, NX Cloud is totally opt-in, and you just with a vanilla NX workspace, you get local caching. Out of the box. You can still, as we mentioned before, using if you bring in an existing React application into the NX workspace, you can take advantage of local caching there. Victor recently shared a post about we're providing integration with the Angular CLI, where we have a command you can run, npx. I'll just throw it out there: npx make Angular CLI faster, and you can run that, and it will update your Angular CLI workspace. And I'm going to show that here. npx make Angular CLI faster. It will run a command that will integrate NX into your workspace, and will actually give you the option to use NX Cloud instantly from the command line there, or just use the local caching, which you'll still get the building and all the local caching for testing up front. And then if you want to connect to NX Cloud later, it also gives you instructions so that you can easily do that too. So yeah,
I think one more thing I can also add is like NX Cloud is not just the caching part. Also gives you a dashboard that I think is useful. You can see like what commands or what commands like test and which project is running the longest. Like it gives you some insight to your workspace that you may not be able to get otherwise, or it's not easy to get. Yeah. So caching aside, I think it's still worth checking out NX Cloud. At least like we do have a free tier now, right?
Yeah, you get 5. Philip promised everyone 25 hours a month last time, but it's only 5. It's only 5 hours a month, 5 free hours a month. And I think we have some other things cooking. I won't spoil it, but we got some other stuff cooking up soon for specific types of projects for NX Cloud. So yeah.
Okay. I actually see this one question in the chat that we can't answer fully, but I think I just want to address it quickly, if you don't mind. Yeah. Sure. So Edward's asking about NX and monorepo organization when it comes to AWS service and Lambdas. So I just want to say, like, it's not a common use case we have at this point, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Brandon, but I haven't seen a workspace personally that does anything like this. But I think that it's been asked a few times, especially because more and more stack.
Probably one of the number one questions that we get probably every time or every other time we do office hours is like organization, workspace organization. Like, how do I pick a good folder structure so that I'm not like deep diving into folders every time I want to get to some place where like you said, whether it be a package or a service, or even a component libraries or features or things like that.
Yeah, so I think AWS and Lambdas aside, I think generally, and we do have a monorepo book as well for
Mhm.
I think it's for Angular devs, but the structure in there actually makes sense for a lot of other setup. So we always recommend people to group their packages by features. So instead of saying like these are components, these are services, we say you should have a feature, and under there you might have components, services, and other I guess concerns. But it's easier rather than having one service folder and like a million packages under there. You group it by feature, and for each feature, you can see like, oh, this one has some Angular components, this one may have some React components, and this one has some functions. That's what I would say at high level. But again, if you want to chat more, you can hit me up on Twitter, and I would love to like talk about organization.
Okay, so you actually like talking about folder organization and how you organize things within a project. Because I know some people get like really hung up on like the folders themselves as opposed to just like a general plan of how do I go about making things not a mess.
Yeah, I think there's so many ways you can tackle it, but to me, it's always like if I'm especially new to a project, can actually find what I'm looking for, right?
Yeah,
Like I think that's the most important part of how you organize stuff.
yeah, for sure. Uh, so this one is, and I think this one is a pretty good question. Is what are the indicators of that a feature is too big? Like how, like just like I said, we're talking about React. So what are the things that you look for, like in a React project, where you say, okay, this feature or this thing is at least on its own is it needs to be broken down further. Like what are some of the indicators that you normally use?
Yeah, I think this is like potentially something that we might be able to help with in terms of like analytics and stats that we can compute for you. But that aside, it's hard to define exactly. Like some people use lines of code. I don't think that's a good metric. I would say if your feature is being touched all the time for different reasons, right? So if you go back to like object-oriented programming and single responsibility principle, like your feature should only be focused on like a few things. Like, so I have a logout feature or like a user profile feature. If I have to touch that every single time I work on any feature, that probably gives you indication of maybe this should be broken down to smaller chunks. And I think the only way you can detect it is to see how your code changes over time. Like if you look at your main branch, right, you can't really tell is this feature too big. The only thing you can kind of rely on is like, okay, how many lines of code do I have in this feature? But I don't think that's a super good indicator. I would just say like if there's really high code churn between different PRs, then that's an indicator there.
Yeah, so if your library is always in the list of affected projects, then you might want to consider.
Yeah, especially if it's like a leaf one, like that's really bad.
Yeah,
If you have a share library, it changes like every day. Probably something is wrong there. Right.
okay. That's probably the point that you need to break it up into smaller, more manageable or more granular pieces. Anyway, I think that's a good rule. But no, we haven't plugged this yet. But you wrote a book on React.
Oh yeah, in progress.
Or in progress. There you go. In progress.
Yeah.
A React book. So that you mentioned that some of the things in the Angular book kind of give you can use some of those guidance. Is there anything specifically in the React book that people have, or in the React book uh, that you normally that you point out a lot, or?
Yeah. So the React book is, I think, a little bit smaller in scope in terms of the Angular book is phrased as like here's a monorepo or monorepo patterns for enterprise projects. The React book is more of a like introduction to NX using React. So in there, I do try to adhere to certain like using feature libraries as opposed to grouping by types. So instead of services and components, you have like features where you group your different projects under. So if you read a book and follow the patterns in there, you generally get a sense of like how you should be doing it. But there's no chapters in there that's specifically saying like here's how you do it. But the book is unfinished, and I do apologize for taking so long. I am going to focus a little bit more on it, like in July, and the target is I will finish it in August, because I'll actually be the one That'll be the
what
1
you're
year
saying
anniversary.
is I shouldn't share the book just yet, or can we share a link to it, or just
Yeah,
for future
so
reference?
we've been sending it out just because what's in there right now is actually still a good introduction,
Hmm.
but it's not going to take you from like starting all the way to deployment. So that's the actual goal. Is like you should be able to start the book and you know nothing about NX, and at the end you should be able to know like, okay, at least I know how to deploy it, or has some idea of how to deploy
Okay.
the entire thing.
All right. I won't. You can. I'll just say that you can go see the in progress book on the Narwhal Connect site, and I believe it's available for free
Yeah,
at the
and
moment.
it's going to remain free even
Yep.
once it's completed.
Okay.
So if you do have right now, you can always read it now, what's in there, and then once we get an update, we'll send an email out to I guess anyone who's on our mailing list.
Hmm.
And maybe it's time to also plug the NX mailing list that
There you go.
I don't
I
know if
didn't.
everyone's on it
I
yet.
didn't. I
You
didn't
should
throw it
be.
out there, but if you're not subscribed to the NX newsletter, you should definitely go to nx.dev and follow the appropriate links to sign up for the newsletter, or even sign up for get emails about office hours. Many of the other things we have office hours. We have plugin office hours. If you want to build a plugin for NX, there's also that. Lots of things you can sign up for. I will bring up the page here so that we can show some of these nice community resources. As we mentioned here, we have our community. We have our GitHub page, of course, where you can file issues for NX. Join our community Slack, NX Slack channel. Follow us on Twitter and subscribe to the NX newsletter to get more information there about how you can get involved with NX itself or extend NX. We'll go ahead and plug some of these community plugins here for Ionic React and domain-driven design. And there's even one for Docusaurus. I saw one recently that it's right here. I didn't know if it was listed officially yet or not, but there's one for Stencil where you can actually build stencil projects within an NX workspace. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's really exciting. I think there's a lot of really cool stuff that people are creating.
Yep, definitely. Yeah, so I think we got a few more minutes left.
I think Nicholas has a really easy question I can answer. So he's talking.
Okay.
So Nicholas asked, does the graph handle both Angular and React projects? And we actually don't care if you're using Angular or React or even anything else, as long as you're using TypeScript.
Yes, we do. We do care.
Sorry, you should only use Angular and React and use NX. Okay.
There you go.
But technically, you can use just like any kind of TypeScript project and it'll just work because we just rely on TypeScript to parse through either JS or TS files to grab the imports.
That was a pretty quick one. Let's see. We'll throw another one up here and then we'll wrap up. Will NX cover the micro front end approach?
So I'm not super familiar with micro front end. Like I know of it. I think Jason Jing wrote a blog post about it at some point, like a while ago.
Yeah, I think he actually wrote one. His blog post actually looked at micro front ends from a React perspective. Let's see if I can find it here.
Yeah, so if you haven't seen that blog post, definitely read through it, check it out. I'm pretty sure it also links to like a repo on GitHub, but I could be wrong. But it will be very unlike Jason to not have a repo for it.
There you go. I'll see if I can bring it up here just so we can get that plug in. React micro front ends and monorepo is a perfect match. He wrote this back in August, so it's still relatively fresh out there. So yeah, if you haven't seen that article yet, I'll link the article in the show notes in the show notes, so you can go back and itself. Yeah, so we'll have a couple more. Let's see. I guess we talked about a lot of stuff, and you gave some spoilers away. But is there anything anything else specifically coming up with NX that you want to cover before we wrap up?
So nothing huge coming down, but we're basically making everything more stable. So we're going through all the issues. As for picking and popularity, we also know there's more use cases that maybe we don't handle super well. So those are all being
You said
addressed.
more more popularity means more
Uh,
issues. Right?
yeah, which is a good problem. One new thing that's coming down for 9.5 is we're supporting style JSX. So if you use Next or just React in general, and you like style JSX, definitely check it out. I think it's really cool technology. So that's coming down for 9.5. But I think for NX10, it's actually a bigger deal for Angular devs and React devs.
Okay. So there's style. You said style JSX.
JSX.
So style
Yeah.
JSX. There's I don't know all the different. I know
Yeah.
there's a lot of them.
So for people who are not familiar with it, basically, you can either use CSS or less or Sass, which is external style sheet, or you can pick something like style components or InMotion, which is like I don't like CSS too much. I just want to write them in JS, so they're like CSS and JS solutions. Style JSX is cool because you write stuff in a style tag, and it scopes everything properly to only your component, unless you decorate it with a global attribute. So it's kind of like you're still writing just normal CSS, except it's inside your JSX. If that makes any sense. So it's a little bit of a different way to tackle writing my style sheet inside my JS file. I think it's a really cool technology, and really like major props to the Vercel team for coming up with it for Next.js.
Cool. Yeah, we'll definitely have to do a follow up on talk about Next.js more. Because I know we kind of covered it that we support it. We'll have to say that for a future session that we can talk about some of the cool things we're doing with Next.js. Yep. So I think we'll wrap up there. I'll go ahead and throw that up there. If you're have any questions about NX DevTools or a question that we didn't get to today, you can at NX DevTools on Twitter. You can ask a question there. As I mentioned before, we have our community support Slack workspace. So you can also join there. You can get that from our community page that I showed earlier. And keep checking out the Narwhal blog for the latest things that we have in React. Latest things that we have in React. We talked about React, Next.js, Gatsby, or even if you want to roll your own plugin, we have NX plugin support for that too. So just be sure to catch up, stay up on those things. And I think with that, like I said, I'm Brandon T. Roberts. It's Jack Jesu on Twitter. Did I say it right? Jesu.
Yeah.
Okay.
The H is silent, which trip a lot of people up.
Okay. Well, then I can't, like I said, I always say I can't be out here like botching people's names. So yeah. Jack on Twitter, Brandon, NX DevTools, and we'll see y'all next time.
Awesome.
See ya.
All right. See ya.